Ever get that feeling, that what we see around us isn't quite the whole story, that maybe there's something deeper running underneath, like those little flashes of insight you get sometimes?
Absolutely. Those aha moments.
Exactly. Well, today we're going to chase that feeling. We're doing a focused deep dive into part 2 of the Mundaka Upanishad.
And the Upanishads, well, they're all about uncovering that deeper reality, aren't they? Revealing Brahman, the ultimate consciousness.
Right.
And Mundaka Part 2 specifically is often seen as like the core teaching, the real essence you find echoed in many other Upanishads.
So our mission today, let's keep it simple. We want to unpack the absolute key insights from Mundaka Upanishad Part 2 for you. Think of it as a quick but thorough guide.
An efficient route to the core ideas.
Yeah, exactly. We've looked at transcripts from Arsha Vidya Gurukulam's channel, plus some PDFs with commentary, so quite a bit of draw on.
Good stuff.
Okay, so summarizing Part 2, where does it kick off? What's the first big idea?
Well, Part 2 really starts by laying the groundwork, defining Brahman, the ultimate reality.
Okay.
It presents Brahman as Satyam, meaning the consciousness principle is the only thing that's truly fundamentally existent, and it's the Karan.
Karanam, the cause.
Exactly, the cause of everything. The entire universe springs from it.
Okay, Satyam, the only real thing, and Karanyam, the cause. So what about, well, this, the world we experience?
Right, so the world is described as karyam, the product or the effect.
The effect of Brahman.
Yes, and sometimes it's even called mithya, an appearance.
Mithya, appearance. Does that mean it's like fake? An illusion?
Not quite like a hallucination, no. It's more like, think of gold and ornaments.
Okay.
The gold is the substance, the satyam,
Yeah.
the ornaments, rings, necklaces. They're just names and forms, karyam. They exist, but their reality depends entirely on the gold.
Ah, I see. So the world's reality is derived from Brahman. It's not independently real.
Precisely. It borrows its reality. And Part 2 emphasizes, that everything we see, the whole cosmos, it originates from and emerges out of this Brahman.
It all comes back to that source.
Yes. And to help us grasp Brahman, Part 2 talks about 4 aspects, or svarupams.
4 aspects. What are they?
Sat, Sit, Dhananda, and Ananta.
Okay, let's break those down. Sat.
Sat is pure existence.
Yeah.
Isness, the fundamental reality of being.
Right.
Sit is pure consciousness. Awareness itself, knowing. And this is really key. Consciousness isn't just something God have, it's what God is.
That's a big shift from maybe more traditional ideas of a creator being.
It is. It places consciousness at the very heart of reality. Then there's Ananda.
Ananda, bliss.
Happiness.
Pure happiness, yeah.
Intrinsic bliss, not dependent on anything external. And finally, Ananta.
Ananta, infinite.
Infinite, limitless, beyond any boundary or definition you could possibly put on it.
Sat, Sit, Ananda, Ananta. Existence, consciousness, bliss, infinite. Wow. Okay.
So that's the nature of Brahman.
But then, how do we get the world of names and forms, the ornaments, from the pure gold? How does that happen, according to Part 2?
Ah, that brings in Maya.
Maya. Heard that one before.
Right. In Part 2, it's described as like the unmanifest potential within Brahman. The seeds of name and form that haven't sprouted yet, but which act as the cause for the universe we see.
So it's the potential within Brahman for all this diversity.
Kind of, yeah. The unmanifested name and form that allows the manifest world to appear.
Okay. Now, many people think of God, or the divine, in terms of specific forms, right? Images, deities. How does Part 2 handle that, given this idea of formless Brahman?
That's a really important point. Part 2 introduces amurta formlessness as the ultimate nature of Brahman.
Formless.
But it also acknowledges that, well, worshipping specific forms can be a really helpful first step, especially if the abstract idea of pure consciousness is, hard to grasp initially.
So those forms are like pointers,
Yeah.
stepping stones.
Exactly, stepping stones towards understanding the formless reality. The scriptures often provide these kinds of supports.
Makes sense. Okay, so if Brahman is formless consciousness, where is it? Is it, like, way out beyond the stars somewhere?
Yeah, that's the natural question. But Part 2 says no, not just out there. It's everywhere, pervading everything.
Everywhere.
And crucially, it's also within each of us. Guhayam nihitam, present deep within the heart.
In the heart.
Yeah. There's that great saying, Akada unde Panduranga du ikada unde. The Panduranga who is worshipped way over there in Pandharpur, he's right here.
So, omnipresent. Not distant.
Not distant at all. This consciousness is the Jagat Karana Ivara, the Lord, the cause of the world, and realizing it's here, now, within you. That changes things.
That definitely shifts your perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's Brahman, the universal reality. What about, well, me, the individual? How does part 2 explain our sense of self?
Right, that brings us to the Jivatma and the Paramatma, the individual soul and the supreme soul.
Jivatma, that's the individual one.
Yes, and part 2 describes the Jivatma as this kind of composite entity. It's a mix.
A mix of what?
It includes the subtle body, the Sukkama Shura, that's your mind, intellect, ego.
Oh.
Then the causal body, Karan Shura, kind of the seed form holding your karmic tendencies.
Right.
Then, Shidapasa, this is important, reflected consciousness, like the light of the sun reflecting in a pot of water.
Reflected consciousness.
And finally, the original consciousness itself, Brahman. So this whole package, subtle body, causal body, reflected consciousness, original consciousness, that's the Jivatma. That's what seems to leave the physical body when it dies, which one source calls the rented house.
So we're much more than just this physical body, according to part 2.
Absolutely. And to illustrate the Jivatma situation, part 2 uses that famous analogy.
The two birds.
The two birds in the same tree, yeah. One bird is busy eating the fruits of the tree, some sweet, some bitter. That's the Jivatma.
Experiencing life, the results of actions, karma.
No, exactly. Happiness, sorrow, attachment, the whole roller coaster. But the other bird,
What's the other bird doing?
it just sits there, watching, calmly observing, not eating the fruit. That's the Paramatma, the witness consciousness.
The experiencer and the witness, both within us.
Mhm.
That's powerful.
It is. And part 2 describes the Jivatma's experience getting caught up in desires, feeling helpless sometimes, dependent on things outside itself for happiness.
Sounds familiar. The human condition, pretty much.
Right. But then it contrasts this with the Paramatma. The Upanishad suggests that the Jivatma's real potential, its true glory, is realized when it turns and recognizes that silent witness.
Recognizes the other bird.
Yes. And here's the kicker. Part 2 says that fundamentally the Jivatma, your essential self, is actually the same as the Paramatma. It's identical to that Kardonshava, the Lord, the cause we talked about earlier.
So deep down, the individual soul is the supreme soul. They're not separate.
That's the core message, not separate at all, one and the same.
Wow. Okay, so if we are fundamentally Brahman, how do we realize that? How does part 2 say we bridge that gap between feeling like the Jivatma bird and knowing we are the Paramatma?
Through knowledge, specifically Paravidya, the higher knowledge.
Higher knowledge.
This is the knowledge that leads directly to understanding Hamam Brahmasmi.
I am Brahman.
Exactly. And the primary method part 2 emphasizes for gaining this knowledge is self-inquiry, Habravikara.
Self-inquiry. Looking within.
Yes, really investigating. Who am I? Am I this body that changes? Am I these thoughts that come and go? Or am I something deeper? It's about shifting your identification away from the temporary stuff.
And discovering.
Discovering I am Karamam, I am the cause, the underlying reality, and realizing that, according to part 2, takes you beyond the fear of death, beyond mortality itself.
Because you identify with the eternal source, not the temporary effect.
Precisely. It's about focusing on the Akasarani Satyam Karamam, the one essential, eternal, true cause, which is the Atma, the self, right here within you.
Okay, focus on the self within. How did that realization actually happen? Does part 2 describe a process?
It suggests kind of progression, yeah? You might start by thinking of the self or God as something out there beyond. Then maybe you see it as present in the world, then closer still as in me.
Okay.
But the final step, the real breakthrough described in part 2, is realizing I as me. I am that consciousness, not just in me, but my very nature.
From out there to is me. That's quite a journey. Are there practices part 2 recommends?
Yes, it mentions dhyanam meditation, specifically meditating on Brahman.
Meditating on Brahman, how?
Often using Om as the symbol, the representation of Brahman. Part 2 gives another great analogy here.
Which one?
The analogy of the bow and arrow.
Ah, yes.
Om is the bow, the Jivatma, your individual self, is the arrow, and Brahman is the target. You draw the bow with focus and release the arrow so it merges completely with the target.
Becoming one with Brahman.
Exactly. But it's crucial to understand this isn't about the arrow traveling somewhere. It's about the arrow, the Jivatma, letting go of its mistaken identity as just an arrow and realizing it is the target. It's about dropping false identifications.
Letting go of who you think you are to realize who you are.
You got it. That's the essence of the practice in part 2. And this self-realization, Atmajanam, part 2 is very clear. It is God realization, Brahma Janam. They aren't two different things. Realize yourself and you've realized the ultimate reality.
One and the same goal. That
Yeah.
simplifies things. Now, what about karma? actions, consequences. Where does that fit in, according to part two? Is doing good deeds enough for liberation?
That's a common question. Part 2 addresses the role and the limitations of karma.
Limitations.
Yes, karma actions and their results can definitely bring you good things. Material benefits, maybe a better rebirth, even mental purity, which is helpful.
Okay, so it has value.
It does. But Part 2 argues karma, by its very nature, keeps you operating within the cycle of cause and effect, birth and death of Sona. Finite actions produce finite results. They don't lead to the infinite, eternal liberation, moksha.
So even good karma keeps you within the cycle.
From the perspective of ultimate liberation presented in Part 2, yes. Because it's still based on the idea of a separate doer and experiencer. It doesn't lead to realizing the non-dual truth of Aham Brahmasmi.
I see. What about things like devotional practices, meditation on specific forms of God? Part two mentions upasana, right?
It does. Upasana, meditation with attributes, is also discussed. It can definitely purify the mind, lead to focus, even grant access to higher realms like Brahmaloka potentially. It's a valid path.
Right.
But again, from the standpoint of the highest knowledge, Paravidya, even Upasana, operates within a framework of duality, meditating on a separate deity. Part 2 points towards transcending even that, to the direct realization of oneness.
So knowledge is the key that unlocks the ultimate door, beyond karma and devotional practices with form.
That's the emphasis in this section of the Upanishad. Knowledge is the direct path.
And how do you get this knowledge reliably, does part two say?
Absolutely. It stresses the importance of a qualified teacher, a guru, someone who has understood the teachings and can guide you.
Learning from a guide.
Yes. And systematic study, following the traditional process. Shravanham, listening carefully to the teachings from the guru and scriptures. Then mananam, reflecting deeply on them, resolving doubts. And finally, nididhaisnam, sustained contemplation, internalizing the truth until it's your own direct understanding.
Hearing, reflecting, contemplating, a structured approach. Okay, so let's say someone follows this path, guided by a guru, and attains this brahmajanam, this self-realization. What are they like? What does part two tell us about the liberated soul, the Jivanmukta?
Ah, the Brahmavid, the knower of Brahman. Part 2 paints a picture of someone who is fundamentally free.
Free from what?
Primarily free from binding desires. They find their joy and contentment within the self. The terms used are atmakrai, playing in the self, and atmarati, rejoicing in the self. Their happiness isn't dependent on external things anymore.
Contentment from within. What if they still seem to enjoy things, like good food or music? Does that mean they aren't really liberated?
Not necessarily. Part 2 suggests that any lingering experiences, even sense pleasures, are often just the playing out of prarabdha karma, the karma that has already started to bear fruit for this lifetime. The key is, there's no attachment, no deep-seated craving or dependency driving it. They can engage with the world, but they aren't bound by it.
Like being in the world, but not of it.
That's a good way to put it. And Part 2 includes that incredible verse, doesn't it, about the light?
Oh, right. The sun doesn't shine there, nor the moon and stars. How does that fit into describing the liberated person?
That verse, 2.2.11, is profound. Natatara Suryobhati. It's saying that in the state of realizing Brahman, the light of the sun, moon, stars, lightning, even fire, none of these external lights illuminate it.
Because
Brahman, consciousness, is the source of all light. Tameva bantamanu bhati sarva. It's shining. Everything else shines. Dasya basa saramida vibhati. By its light, all this is illumined.
So consciousness is the ultimate light, the light of awareness itself.
Exactly. Our senses, our mind, they seem like lights because they reveal the world, right? But Part 2 says they are themselves illumined by this deeper consciousness, the Sakya Caitanyam, the witness, and they can't turn around and illuminate that.
You can't see the eye with the eye.
Precisely. The knower of Brahman, the Jnaniya, has shifted their attention from the objects seen and even the instruments of seeing to the seer itself, the light of awareness.
Wow. What else characterizes them, according to part two? What about things like good and bad deeds, punya and papa?
For the Jnani described in Part 2, they transcend both. Punya, merit, and papa, demerit, are seen as two sides of the coin of bondage, keeping you tied to results and cycles. The liberated soul goes beyond that duality.
Beyond merit and demerit.
Yes. Part 2 also touches on videha mukti, liberation after the physical body drops, and jivan mukti, which is liberation while still living in the body.
Jivanmukti, liberation here and now.
That's the ideal. And for such a person, the different types of karma sanyachita accumulated from past lives, agami, being created now for the future, and even prarabdha, currently playing out, lose their binding power. They don't create future compulsions or strong attachments.
So karma doesn't stick to them in the same way.
Right. The ultimate state they attain, Part 2 says, is paramasamyam, supreme oneness, or supreme equality, with the all-pervading consciousness, a complete merging.
Supreme oneness. And isn't there an emphasis on truthfulness on this path?
Very much so. Part 2 highlights satyam, truth, as vital. Satina pantafi taradevaina. By truth, the path leading to the divine is laid out. Honesty, integrity in thought, word, and deed is crucial.
Truth paves the way.
And the final, powerful declaration of Part 2 really sums it all up. Brahmavid, Brahmaiva bhavati.
Which mean?
The knower of Brahman becomes Brahman.
Knowing it is being it. There's no separation left.
That's the ultimate realization.
Okay, so pulling it all together, Part 2 of the Mundaka Upanishad really gives us this profound map. It shows us Brahman as the only true reality, our own self as essentially that same reality, and then lays out the path of knowledge, self-inquiry, guided learning, meditation, to actually realize that oneness.
That's a great summary. It's all about waking up to the fact I am consciousness.
That fundamental aha moment.
Exactly. And this part of the Upanishad provides such a clear framework for understanding that.
It really does. This deep dive into Part 2 has been, well, incredibly clarifying. It's just amazing how relevant and deep these ancient texts still feel.
They definitely hold timeless wisdom.
So as we wrap up, maybe one last thought for our listeners to chew on, based on everything Part 2 covers.
Okay. How about this? If you really take on board this core idea from Part 2, that Brahman, this infinite consciousness, is the sole underlying reality, and that is your true nature, how might that genuinely change the way you look at everyday problems, stresses, or even joys?
How does knowing I am Brahman impact the day-to-day?
Yeah. What shifts when you start seeing the world and yourself through that lens? It's something Part 2 really invites you to explore, not just intellectually, but experientially.
That's a great question to sit with, a truly transformative perspective. And of course, if this summary of Part 2 has sparked your interest, digging into the Mundaka Upanishad itself, maybe with a good commentary, is highly recommended.
Absolutely. There's always more depth.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, until our next deep dive, keep exploring, keep asking those deep questions.